Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we will be reviewing the Kanda Estste Wash Processed Kenya from Luminous Coffee. And there's the box right there. And I'll go ahead and take you around it one more time as I really like the takeout box design. Luminous, based out of Henderson, Nevada, and they're a coffee roaster that has appeared on this channel one time before when we reviewed their Uriel Gonzalez, a static cherry natural processed Panamanian coffee. And in that review, we mentioned that we had a second review coming up of a coffee we liked a lot more, and that's this one right here. And just like that previous review, we have a fortune cookie for the end, so stay tuned for that, as this right here is day 33. And recipe we went with for this coffee was their recipe, which is a 14.2 to 1 water to coffee ratio brewed at 205 degrees Fahrenheit. I like this one best through the V60, and they suggest a more semi-coarse grind, so that's what we went with for this one. Now, in terms of roast profile, this one came out a little bit more light than I think I was expecting, so I will say it's a relatively light roast profile. That's to kind of say that it's lighter than a lot of the stuff that we review pretty regularly in terms of American roasters, so something like Sweet Bloom, but it definitely is a little bit more developed than some of the more Nordic coffee roasters and a place like Say that we also review pretty regularly. So it falls in that kind of wide spectrum, but still came out a little bit more light than I think I was expecting. Hopefully that gives you a good idea. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 16, first impression, and what was really interesting was when I was brewing this coffee, it had a very savory aroma to it, so I was fully expecting this to be one of those kind of classic Kenyan coffees with a lot of savory aspects. But interestingly, upon the first impression, it came out a lot more sweet and clean than I was expecting, which can be atypical of Kenyan coffees for me sometimes. So it had the Kenyan attribute in terms of the body, but other than that, it just came out a little bit more red berry sweet forward, which was a very positive first start to this coffee. So I liked that first try. Day 18, ran it through the Chemex, and it was significantly less vibrant through this brew method, as a lot of the savory aspects were more in the forefront on this day, and the sweetness was a little bit more tame and on the back end. Cherry, again, this time I aligned a little bit more with cherry, and they do have a raspberry note listed on here, and I could see that because at times it is a slightly tart red berry, but for the most part, given that it was a little bit more of a sugary sweet red berry for me, I like the cherry note better. But still, for the most part on this day, it was a little bit more tame. Day 20, quite reminiscent of a fruit chew, as the overall savory aspect to the cup is still a little bit more dialed back than expected. Slightly more on the citric side of things, as the listed lemongrass is a little bit more prominent and pronounced in the finish. That's something we'll discuss a little bit more, as I think it kind of turned into this little more herbal aspect within the cup. Solid but moderately tame on this day as well. We continue on to day 22 as we ran into the Chemex, and this was the best day of the coffee to this point, as there was this slightly maple-like sweetness to the cup, and that's something we'll elaborate on a little later, as this was the only day I kind of looked at it as maple, as there are some days in the future where I look at it as something entirely different, but it was complementing the prominent cherry aspect. Citric brightness is quite mild, and the cup as a whole is more sweetened and well-rounded, so I'm really liking the way that this Kenyan is headed. Day 24, best day of the coffee to this point, back through the V60, as it's emphasizing the berry sweetness, but in a more sugary berry sense. So that's why I really like the cherry a little bit more than the raspberry. Savoriness and acidity are actually in a more moderate tone, and as a result, there's a very clean abundance of the fruit aspects to it. Really liking that. Day 26, back through the Chemex, and it just doesn't have the same vibrancy through this brew method. So while I had one good day, I think it's just because the coffee with a little bit more time was just improving as a whole. So there is a slight improvement relative to the other previous Chemex days. It's still lacking in the clear red berry sweetness for a slightly more savory aspect. It's a little bit more, for lack of a better term, Kenyan-like through the V60, correction, through the Chemex. Day 28, best day of the coffee to this point, as there are sweeter aspects that are continuing to dominate the cup that is complemented by a slight herbal aspect to it. So at this moment, it reminded me of something I really like from Kenyan coffees when they kind of taste like cherry soda. So I would say that complementary herbality with the cherry very much reminded me of a sweeter cherry soda, given that this coffee was a little on the sweeter side of things. I've been touching on that maple very briefly, but I think the best way I aligned it from this point going forward was it did have this kind of like sugary caramelized taste to it, and that was very much in line with the soda flavor note that we're going with on here. Again, citric and acidic aspects are a little bit more moderate relative to a pretty clean cup, and I think that kind of complemented it. So maybe think of a lighter cherry lime, cherry lemon sort of soda in this coffee. Day 30, final notes we have, and there's a fair bit more of the herbal aspect, which is more than fine because it just does kind of skew a little bit more on that like cherry soda side of things for me, as the berry sweetness is a little bit more secondary, but still complementary and still abundant enough to really be one of the more distinct and primary components within this coffee. A slight bit more of the bright aspects as the candied sugar is present yet again. Another solid day of this coffee. It does improve with it cooling down as well, as a lot more of the sweetness does seem to open up. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. All right, and for level 4, so let's go through those. The cleanliness level 4. That is actually a little rare for Kenyan coffees for me because I rarely put them above a level 3 unless I really like the cleanliness within it. And this one right here, I feel like definitely justified that level 4. That's really good in terms of the clarity. Finish, level 4. It does have a lasting finish, but what's really positive about the finish is that it's not a overly savory lasting finish. So it's a more sweet kind of cherry-like finish to it. So I really like it there at that level 4 mark. Sweetness, level 4. It's a really sweet Kenyan coffee. It's perfect right there at that level 4 mark. When you get it at its best, I really like the just clarity and sweetness combination that is present within this coffee. Berry fruit, level 4. I've been saying cherry this entire time, and they, as mentioned, list that raspberry flavor note listed on here. I could see either, honestly. It just does kind of remind me of a red berry in general, but a more sugary red berry, so that's kind of the direction I'd point you towards for that. Citrus, level 3, yes, it is more of a kind of tertiary factor. If anything, I think the best way I can kind of identify it is the herbality within this coffee. I think that's the lemongrass flavor note that they have listed on here. If anything, for me, it's a little bit more just kind of herbal as opposed to like solid, straightforward lemongrass. It's not that kind of overly lemony, grassy sort of taste you can get from a lot of Say's coffees. So I think it's really good there at that level 3 mark. If anything, I think it does a good job of complementing the berry sweetness in this cup. Caramel, level 3. That's kind of an interesting one because I mentioned that it has this kind of candied sugary aspect to it, and that's where I'm getting that caramel as. It's not really like a specifically caramel level 3, but much more of the kind of candied sweetness, and that's the best category I could lump that into. A lot of other things to discuss in this tasting wheel. Body, level 3. So yes, it has that classic Kenyan body. You're not sacrificing the body for the more sweet and clean aspect, so that's a great trading point to me. Acidity, level 3. I found that to be interesting because one of the notes that they have listed on here is tangy acidity, and the acidity is a little bit more moderate, especially relative to a Kenyan coffee, so that's a selling point to me, and I know it could be a detracting point to some that really love the bright Kenyan-like acidity for mulatto coffees because I was fully expecting that to reach the level 4 mark, but I couldn't justify it there. And then the savory note at a level 2, that's probably going to be my favorite part of this coffee because my biggest grievance with Kenyan coffees is that they can be a little too tomato-like. This one right here, so much of the savory aspects were really dialed back, especially depending on brew method, and it could have probably justified a level 3 through the Chemex, but through the V60, it's a very clean and not so savory cup of coffee, so I really like it there at that mark. I don't think that there's anything else necessarily worth noting in this tasting wheel. I think it's a pretty nice representation of what I was experiencing from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, I definitely like this one. It was one of my more enjoyable Kenyan coffees I have had this year. Not quite as much as that Kenyan we'd reviewed from Sweet Bloom earlier this year, but definitely probably a top 3 wash processed Kenyan we have had this year, and it's very easy to see why. I like my Kenyans to be a little bit more clean, a little bit more sweet, and definitely more dialed back on the savory aspects. So this one really hit on 3 of my big 4 marks where it had great fruit components, great sweetness, great clarity, especially relative to a lot of other Kenyan coffees. It was just kind of lacking the floral aspects, which maybe I was hoping for a little bit more, but in terms of just the expectations and the experience, I would say that this one did a pretty good job. I really quite enjoyed this one. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, I have to say again that it's the type of people that enjoy Kenyan coffees that I like, and I think that there are 2 categories for Kenyan lovers. There are people that love the really bright, acidic Kenyan coffees, and then there are those that like the more, I would say, sweet cups of coffee, the ones that might not have that same sort of robust savoriness to it, and it falls into that second category, which is a lot more me when it kind of tastes like soda or it tastes like candy. And this one has a little bit of both of those things, and that's why it was a lot more of my type of Kenyan. All right, last thing left. Let's go ahead and open up this fortune cookie and see what this one says. All right, and this one, new and rewarding opportunities will soon develop for you. All right, if you guys are enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. But this right here has been a review of the Kanda Estate Wash Process Kenya from Luminous Coffee. Thank you for watching.